What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. So one of the biggest questions I get most frequently is what frame rate should you be shooting your real estate videos at? Should you do everything at 60 frames per second? Should you do 30 frames per second? Should you film at 24 frames per second? I know it's kind of overwhelming trying to decide every single setting when you're just starting out, so hopefully this video helps you speed that process up. So even though it definitely all comes down to creative choice in the end, once you get to know what you're doing, I wanted to break this down simply to where no matter what you're shooting, you're gonna have a good idea what frame rates are gonna work best and what's gonna help you ultimately get the creative outcome that you want in the end. So pretty much the gold standard for video is to shoot in 24 frames per second. That's going to give you the most natural looking movement, create a little bit of motion blur, and it's going to feel the most like what we're used to watching on video. So it's going to look more cinematic, less digital, more like a movie. But whenever you start adding higher frame rates into the picture, no pun intended, it opens up some opportunities to create a little bit of a different feeling when you're watching the video. So for example, my favorite is typically to shoot at 30 frames per second because whenever you are working on a 24 frames per second timeline in your editing, you can slow down 30 frames per second to 80% speed and create a little bit of a slightly dreamier looking slow motion feeling to it, and it also smooths out some of your camera movements. So that's a bonus, and that's why I really like to shoot 30 frames per second. Whenever you double that to 60, another one of my favorites, you can slow it down to 40% speed and get a really dreamy slow motion shot that's not too slow. A lot of people really like 120 frames per second, but unless you're doing something with like tons of action, usually in real estate videos, there's not really a need for 120 frames per second. To sum that up, the end result is gonna look different depending on what frame rate you're shooting it at. So 24, super just natural, normal looking. 30 frames per second, slowed down to 24 frames per second is gonna give you a little bit smoother, a little bit dreamy looking slow motion. And then 60 frames a second is gonna give you that really slow 40% speed slow motion and slow down your camera movements even more to where it looks extra dreamy and special. So once you understand those, you can start applying that creatively during your shoot to get the outcome that you want. So just to circle back, no matter what frame rate you actually shoot on, I still work on a 24 frames per second timeline in my editing programs. All right, so 24 frames a second. Here's where I use that the most. So if anybody is on camera talking, like if you're doing a guided tour, always film that in 24 frames per second. A lot of cameras just have 23.9876 frames per second or whatever it says. And that's as close as you're gonna get. Mostly just cinema cameras have actual 24 frames per second. So if someone's on camera talking, you're recording audio, you need those real-time movements, you definitely want to film 24 frames per second. The second reason that I like to use 24 frames per second is in lower light scenarios. So no matter what frame rate you're shooting at, you want to have your shutter speed at double that. So 30 frames per second, you want to have 1/60 for your shutter speed. For 60 frames per second, you want to have 1/120 for your shutter speed. That's going to give you the most natural looking results and make sure you are getting enough frames fast enough while you're recording. So because you're able to lower your shutter speed at the slower frame rates, you're able to bump up the exposure just a little bit and get cleaner results in lower light scenarios. Bonus tip for low light scenarios, if you are not recording somebody on camera and it's just like a room that's not moving or anything, you could break that rule and do half speed if you're careful and pretty much double your exposure. So you could do 1/25 of a second instead of 1/50th of a second for 24 frames per second. That's a lot of words. So if you're in a pinch, you could do that as long as you're careful and you can get a bit less noise in your shot. I would still recommend do a normal one just in case it comes out looking weird on your computer though. 30 frames per second is pretty much the safe go-to for me for wide shots, for detail shots if I want to, and for exterior shots as well. When I slow that down to 80% in post, the speed usually works out to be just about where I like it. So that works for me really well, and it also allows me to keep my other camera settings like ISO down to where I can get a lot less noise on my video for interiors. And that brings us to 60 frames per second. You see a lot of people posting about filming everything in 60 frames per second, and it is going to be the most versatile frame rate to shoot at, because you could do like 80% speed, you could do 40% speed, so you can get a lot more creative looking results in your edit. So even though it is super flexible and great to be shooting at 60 frames per second, be careful with that, because if you don't have a camera that has really good low light performance, then the second you go into a dark room and film 60 frames per second, you're going to get some really noisy images. So make sure you are working with your camera to get the best, cleanest results. So definitely make sure to try this stuff out, see what your camera is actually capable of, and see what the limits really are. When is it too noisy? How fast should you be walking, doing your gimbal movements and stuff like that? Maybe make a little cheat sheet for yourself just in case you forget while you're in the moment. It's really good to have that for each camera you're using, because they're all different and have their strengths and weaknesses. So hopefully all that makes sense and clears the air if you are confused about this. I know it's a lot to figure out when you're just starting out. So that about wraps it up for this video. Hope it was helpful. If you're new, check out some of my other videos. I've got lots of tutorials on shooting and editing, behind the scenes and stuff. And as always, let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I'm glad to help you out. I appreciate all of y'all's support and look forward to seeing y'all on the next one. Peace.